Last time, we discussed the first two waves of radical reform in the city and speech, the equality of the sexes among the guardians and the communalization of the family. The communalization of the family brought to completion the creation of an almost total devotion to the common good among the ruling class within the city and speech, in effect by abolishing as much as possible all private interests that the ruling class might have. And the concern was that otherwise, what Thrasymachus said about politics in Book 1 would be true in this city. Namely, those who were the stronger in the city would use that power for their own advantage, rather than the common good. All the provisions of the city and speech have been intended to create a ruling class that does not act the way Thrasymachus says all rulers do. But as we've also seen, there is a lot in human nature that resists such measures. There's a lot in us that draws us towards pleasure, towards private interests, towards exclusive attachments, and hence there has to be an almost total regulation of the guardians' lives. And then the claim that we saw at the end last time, the third wave of radical reform that Socrates proposes, is that the city they have just described, and in particular the communalization of the family, will only be possible if the city is ruled over by kings who are philosophers. This is treated as an extreme claim by Glaucon, who challenges it and says Socrates must prove it. And so, in this lesson, we will be looking at Socrates' argument, which begins by him clarifying who he means when he's talking about who a philosopher is. So he discusses who philosophers are, and then explains why philosophers have all of the virtues and talents that are necessary to be the best possible rulers. Then, as at the beginning of Book 4, when Socrates has proven this, Adeimantus again interrupts and challenges Socrates and forces him to say more. And this gives us an extensive discussion of the relationship between philosophy and politics. And this lesson will conclude with a brief discussion of Socrates' attempt to show that it is possible to persuade a political community to accept a philosopher as its absolute king. As we'll see, Socrates never proves that this is actually possible, and this calls into doubt the possibility of the city as a whole that they have discussed. But to begin with, Socrates has to explain who philosophers are. And he says, well, philosophers, meaning Greek philosophos, means somebody who loves wisdom. Socrates says, philosophers are lovers of wisdom. They're lovers of learning. They are lovers of all wisdom. They wish to learn everything. And Glaucon says that makes them look rather indiscriminate, like people who just wander around always wanting to see the next new thing. And Socrates says, well, not quite, because in particular, he says, philosophers are lovers of the sight of the truth. That is what they are madly, even erotically in love with, the truth. And Glaucon says, well, what do you mean by that, lover of the sight of the truth? And here's what Socrates says, because in explaining what he means, this is when we have the introduction into the Republic, the famous Platonic forms or ideas. Form translates the word eidos. Idea is just a transliteration of the Greek word ideia. And these words Socrates uses to describe, at least hypothetically, you might say the fundamental basis of reality. And here's where they come in, because it turns out that the philosophers are lovers of truth and lovers of wisdom because they seek with their intellect to know the forms or ideas of things. He says this, since fair or beautiful is the opposite of ugly, they are two. To which Glaucon says, of course. And since they are two, isn't each also one? That is so as well. Right? So there's the beautiful, and then there's the ugly. One thing, another thing. He says, the same argument also applies then to justice and injustice, good and bad, and to all the forms. Each is itself one, but by showing up everywhere in a community with actions, bodies, and one another, each is an apparitional many. Now that's abstract and somewhat confusing, but what he has in mind is this. There are many just things. There are many unjust things. There are many good things. There are many bad things. But alongside that, there's also justice and injustice and good and bad. So in our world, in our experience, we see many different goods and many different bads and many different just things and many different unjust things, but somehow we understand what those things are because all those many bad things somehow partake of this common form, badness or goodness. And goodness is different from the various good things. It is something separate. It is one. This is the basic idea behind the Platonic notion of the forms. And I should mention that both eidos and idea, these words come from the same root, a Greek word, root meaning vision. But what he has in mind in talking about the form of something is not how it looks to the senses, but you might say how it looks to the mind, how the mind sees things for what they are. So forms, the forms, these ideas, goodness, badness, justice, injustice, and the like, these are, as it were, kind of hypotheses that are meant to explain the intelligibility of the world, right? We experience the world through our senses. We see colors, we see shapes, there are sizes, there are smells, there are sounds, and so forth. The world is given to us through the senses. But the world that we experience through our senses is not known by us simply by means of our senses. Rather, things show up to us not as bundles of sensible properties, but rather as particular kinds of things. I see a brown, furry object, it makes the sound bark, and I say, oh, it's a dog. Well, my senses don't tell me that it's a dog. My senses just tell me that it's brown, it's furry, it's moving, it makes certain sounds. My senses see those sensible properties. It's my mind that sees through the senses that the sensible object I'm looking at is a dog, a particular kind of being that's not another kind of feeling or being. Or think about this. Think about a painting, right? What's a painting? It's a bunch of pigments of different colors and textures spread on a canvas. And I look at a painting and I say, it's beautiful. Well, its beauty is not some sensible property in its own right. It's not as though a painting, there's the size of a painting and the texture of a painting and the color of the painting, and then alongside these things there's the beauty of the painting. The beauty of the painting is something that I perceive somehow by means of my senses, but not with my senses. It's my mind again. And so, generally speaking, the world that we experience through our senses has a kind of intelligible character that is not delivered to us simply through sense experience, or doesn't seem to be at least. So where does it come from? Well, this is where you have the hypothesis about the forms or ideas. The idea that there are these eternal, unchanging, immaterial beings, which he calls the forms, that serve as the foundation for reality. And meanwhile, there is the sensible, material world that we inhabit with our bodies that is in a state of constant flux and change. And yet, despite all of this change, there is a certain basic intelligible order that we grasp. And the claim is that this intelligible character of the world comes from the fact that the various sensible beings, which are perishable and changing, somehow participate in the various forms. Dogs participate in the form of dogness. Beautiful objects participate in the form of the beautiful. Or, to use an example closer to home in the Republic, we see a certain action or a certain person as just because somehow he or his action partakes of the form of justice. Right? Because remember, the justice of an action is not a sensible property, right? We see and hear someone speaking the truth, for example, and we say, well, that was a just thing to do. Well, the justice of that act was not perceived by our senses, it was perceived by our minds. And of course, our minds could go wrong, right? The basis of Socratic dialectic is the fact that although we see things participating in these forms all the time, we seem to have contradictory understandings of what they are. Well, Socrates insists that only philosophers truly care to achieve knowledge through the pursuit of these intelligible forms of things. Most people, he says, are concerned about pleasure, money, power, honor, their families, success, things like that, things in the world. Only philosophers seek the truth about things for their own sake. They are not, as Socrates says, practical men, hoi praktikoi, by which he means people who are concerned with practical business. For example, guardians, right? What do the guardians care about? The city. Philosophers seek to understand the world by transcending towards its intelligible character. They don't seek to change the world. And they don't seem to want much of this world. And this is why Socrates says most people are not lovers of truth or wisdom, but lovers of opinion. That is to say, they're lovers of various things that they have opinions about. They have notions about the way the world is, derived from authority, perhaps derived from experience, but they're full of all sorts of notions of what things are, what's valuable, what's not, what they should be doing. Everybody has opinions about these things, and generally speaking, people tend to be satisfied with the opinions that they have, and they don't like to see them challenged. Right? Think of Cephalus or Thrasymachus. Don't like to be challenged in their opinions. Socrates says most people are like that, except philosophers, who, through their pursuit and attainment of wisdom, seek to transcend the world of mere opinion and arrive at truth. They, he says, are the ones who are truly awake to reality, while everyone else lives in a kind of dream, taking this world, the world of the senses, with its objects and its good things, as though that's the only world there is, the only world that matters, and they're unable to bring their souls to see that there is a truer, more beautiful world behind or above the world that our senses give us, and that the value that we find in the world given to us through the senses is ultimately derived from its participation in this other, intelligible world. That's the claim. Now, I want to make 4 general reflections before moving on. First, the existence of these forms or ideas is asserted or hypothesized, but not demonstrated. And in fact, the existence of the forms will not be proven or attempted. He won't even attempt to prove the existence of these forms within this dialogue. So they retain a kind of hypothetical or provisional status. Second, it seems that Socrates assumes that the soul can actually arrive at knowledge of the forms, even though Socrates at times in the Republic and oftentimes in other dialogues seems quite skeptical of the notion that genuine knowledge or genuine wisdom is humanly attainable. Right? Philosophers love and pursue wisdom. In the Republic, it is assumed not only that they pursue wisdom, but that they attain it. But we may question whether that's true, given things Socrates says elsewhere. The third thing I want to say is that the forms are not, this is not a popular view nowadays. Most people reject this sort of Platonic, what they call idealism. But it's not a crazy hypothesis, since really it's an attempt to explain the strange mixture of constant change, yet persistent identity that we do actually find in our experience. That the world is divided up into kinds of things, and they're constantly changing, and yet somehow they stay the same. Right? And the forms are the positing of the forms is a way of trying to explain this. It's an opinion that, for example, Aristotle wrestled with greatly before he rejected it. But it's not crazy. And the last thing I want to say about this is that you will get the notion of the forms all wrong if you think of them as mental constructs or as subjective phenomena that exist inside our mind and that somehow we arrive at by the mind kind of abstracting qualities from our sense experience. That's what's usually called as empiricism. You can associate it with Locke or Hume. But that's not Plato. Plato doesn't assume that the mind somehow imposes order on the flux of the senses. he starts more naively, as it were, with the reflection that the world that we live in has a certain kind of immediate intelligibility to it. We recognize what things are and sort of know how to act. We know how to talk about things, oftentimes how to use the right names for them and so forth. Right? So the hypothesis of the forms seeks to work from that common experience of the intelligibility of the world in order to try to arrive at some notion of what makes it possible that the world has this character, without simply assuming that everything we know must come from the senses and that ideas are mental constructs. That could be true, but it's an assumption that Plato does not make. And, to be honest, our normal experience isn't that somehow first we're just in a world that's a flux of sound and shape and color, and then somehow we figure out what things are, but rather our experience is that we're in the world and things kind of show up as what they are. And the forms is a hypothesis for explaining how the world can have that character of change and yet persistence of identity through change. So enough about the forms. There's a lot more that could be said, but there's not time for that. After Socrates has explained that philosophers pursue the forms and are lovers of wisdom, not lovers of opinion, he then turns to the question of whether philosophers thus described really are the most qualified to rule a political community. Right? And he makes a couple arguments here. On the one hand, since rulers of the city have to preserve the laws and guide the city in accordance with what is just and good and noble, and since only philosophers have knowledge of the good and the just and the noble, Socrates says, therefore, philosophers are intellectually, you might say, most qualified to rule. They have knowledge of what the laws aim at. But a qualification is added, right, that Glaucon agrees with. But that by itself, just that intellectual qualification, doesn't prove that they should be in charge, because, of course, they also have to have the proper experience, right? If they have no experience with political and military matters, it doesn't matter how smart they are, they're not going to be able to be in charge. So they need experience, too. But that's not a big deal, because that can be supplied. The main other thing that Socrates has to prove that the philosophers have is, as he says, all the other virtues, all the virtues of a guardian. If the philosophers are going to be in charge, they can't just be wise, they have to also be courageous and moderate and all those other things. So Socrates has to prove to Glaucon that lovers of wisdom must have all the virtues of a guardian. And he does claim this, but what is curious is that in going through his account of the virtues of the philosopher and showing that they are the same virtues, in fact what he proves is that philosophers have a radically different set of virtues, different from those of the guardians, even though they have the same names. And so what happens is we get a kind of list of philosophic virtues that roughly match the various virtues that were discussed in the music education of the guardians in Book 2 and Book 3. And verbally he shows they're the same. He says, well, like the guardians, the philosophers have no taste for falsehood. They are moderate. They are not greedy. They are not illiberal, but rather magnificent. They are courageous. They're not unjust. They are tame. And in addition, they learn well, and they have a good memory, and they're measured and charming and graceful, and all these sorts of things. All these various qualities that have analogs to qualities that were attributed earlier to the guardians. But if you look through his reasoning in these passages, you'll find that although the names of the philosophic virtues are the same as the guardian virtues, their content is radically different. So, for example, philosophers are truthful in the sense that they love the truth and want to know the truth and do not want to have a lie in their soul. And this is quite different from the more humble truthfulness of the guardians, which is truthfulness in the sense that they believe they must always tell the truth to their rulers. They must be honest. Not because they're pursuing truth or wisdom, but because a good citizen is honest. And remember, this conviction that they ought to obey their rulers is partly shored up by their belief in a lie, the noble lie about the hierarchy. So the truthfulness of the philosopher and the truthfulness of the guardian are the same in name only. But the truthfulness of the guardian is oriented towards the good of the city, whereas the truthfulness of the philosopher is oriented towards the attainment of the truth itself. Likewise, philosophers are said to be courageous. They do not view death as something terrible, but the reason why, which Socrates gives, is because they give themselves over to the contemplation of all time, of eternity, and all being. And in light of that, they do not consider human life to be something of great importance. Human things are not of great importance in light of the cosmos. Therefore, they don't fear death. That's very different from the courage of the guardians. Remember, the guardians' courage was the belief that death is not something bad for a good man, and that what's truly terrible is for your city to be destroyed. But of course, what that means is that the guardians actually think that human affairs are quite important. In fact, they think their city is the most important thing. That's why they need to give everything, if needed, in order to defend it. So in other words, philosophic courage is entirely different from the guardian courage. Philosophic courage rests in detachment from human things, whereas the guardian's courage derives from total attachment to the common good. Very different. A philosopher would not think that the most terrible thing is the destruction of some contingent human city. Finally, another example. Philosophers are said to be moderate. But why are they said to be moderate? Because they are so erotically given over to the pursuit of wisdom that they just don't have the time or the energy or the inclination to pursue other desires. Right? What are the pleasures of food or drink or sex in comparison to the pleasure of the contemplation of being and eternity? He says it's sort of like when you have, when you divert a river in a particular direction, there's no water left over to go anywhere else. So in the same way, it's almost like all the energy in a philosopher's soul is aimed at the attainment of wisdom, and he just doesn't have anything left over to be concerned about food and clothes and drink and things like that. That's very different from the moderation of the guardian. The moderation of the guardian consisted in austere self-control, right? Suppression of bodily desires for the sake of service to the city and obedience to the rulers. It has nothing to do with wisdom. And this gets to the sort of the main point here, which is that these virtues, the virtues of the philosopher and the virtues of the guardian, although verbally similar, are radically different because in the end they are in the service of radically different goals. All the virtues that are listed as those of a philosopher are in one way or another necessary for the pursuit of truth or consequences of the pursuit of truth. They are functional in that sense. They are means to the attainment of wisdom, or the results of the attainment of wisdom. Whereas the virtues of the guardian are all in the service of the city and the common good. Philosophic virtue is ordered towards the attainment of wisdom for oneself. Guardian virtue is ordered towards the preservation of the common good of one's city. It is not at all clear that these two ends can be rendered harmonious, given the fact that the philosopher sees human things, including the city, as of decisively lower dignity than truth itself. So what we have here are actually two radically different sets of virtues that Socrates is trying as much as possible to make look harmonious in order to claim that yes, philosophers have not only wisdom, but they have all the other virtues too, and therefore they should be put in charge. But he's convinced Glaucon. Glaucon says, yes, he goes through that list of virtues, this is fantastic, these are the best human beings, of course they should be in charge. And just like his earlier ready acceptance of the abolition of private property and things like that, Glaucon doesn't object here, but instead Adeimantus, who's more kind of close to the ground, objects, and he says, Socrates, you've just made a great argument, and in theory, we are all convinced. There's just one problem, and that problem is that this magnificent philosopher you've just described does not match in any way my experience or anybody else's experience of what philosophers are actually like. So even if you've proven in speech that philosophers are these magnificent beings, our experience of philosophers tells us otherwise. Because in my experience, there are some philosophers who are decent guys, but they are totally useless and impractical. And then on the other hand, there are other philosophers who are in fact completely vicious and untrustworthy. But I've never seen anybody who matches what you describe. So how would you defend yourself from that, Socrates? And Socrates, in response, says, you know what, Adeimantus? You're right. But not in the way you think. So let me explain. And in the process, Socrates gives an account of the philosophic life that shows that, in fact, it's in great tension with the city. But here's how it goes. In the first case, he says, you're right, Adeimantus. There are these decent but useless and impractical philosophers. But the reasons for this are different from what you think. And here he gives a very famous image, the image of the ship of state. It's an image of politics. He says, imagine there's this ship, and the ship has a captain, and the captain is big and strong, but he's also kind of stupid. Then there are a bunch of sailors, and all of these sailors spend all their time fighting with one another and trying to figure out how they can put themselves in charge of the ship. Why do they want to be in charge of the ship? Because they want to have access to the pantry, basically. They want all the spoils. So they spend all their time trying to figure out how to put themselves in charge so that they can get all the good stuff on the ship. Sometimes they'll do that by, as it were, putting a spell on the owner of the ship and then just taking over and running riot. Other times, they'll actually bind the owner and throw him in the brig and take over. And then they'll spend all their time drinking and feasting, and the ship just wanders off nowhere. Socrates says, but imagine at the same time there's somebody on this ship who actually has the captain's art, the person who knows how to navigate the ship and knows that the person who should be in charge of the ship is not the person who knows how to raid the pantry, it's the person who knows how to read the stars and the seasons and how to guide the ship. That's the true captain. But the thing is that all those sailors, they just want the good stuff, so they're not going to pay any attention to this guy who has the true knowledge of being a captain. They're going to call him a stargazer and a prattler and an impractical man, and they're going to have contempt for him. And Socrates says, that's what politics is like. The people of the city are like the owner, powerful but dumb and easily led. The sailors who run riot are like the politicians that we know, who are constantly squabbling with one another to try to get power so they can get good stuff for themselves and their friends. And the person who possesses the true captain's art, that's the philosopher. He's the one who has the knowledge to rule. And he's decent. But he's useless. Why is he useless? Not because he lacks the knowledge necessary to rule. He's useless because politics is so corrupt that nobody in politics wants to use him. Nobody wants to listen to him. And he's neglected. So those decent but useless philosophers blame their uselessness not on them, but blame the city for failing to make use of them. That's the first part of the response, which is interesting because the response makes it look as though philosophers would be happy to be in charge if only they were asked. And it also makes philosophic knowledge look as though it is ordered towards the good of the city. And those are two things that will be called into question shortly. I'm going to skip over something and then come back to it. So next I'm going to say, Socrates says, alongside, these decent and useless ones, yes, there are these corrupt, vicious philosophers that you talk about, Adeimantus. But you know who those people are? They're not really philosophers. They're imposters. They're people who pretend to be philosophers in order to try to win for themselves a reputation for wisdom. So don't blame philosophy for these vicious philosophers. Those people are imposters. Right, so these are the two big classes that Adeimantus has talked about. The decent but useless philosophers would in fact be great benefactors to the city, but the city refuses to use them. And the vicious philosophers aren't really philosophers at all, so you can't blame philosophy for that. So in neither case can you blame philosophy for the experiences that Adeimantus has had. But in between these two discussions, Socrates discusses the fact that most people who have the talents and virtues that it would take to live the philosophic life become corrupted before they can ever actually become philosophers. And here is where Socrates criticizes the political order most strongly. Because you can think of it this way. Adeimantus has just put philosophy on trial in the name of the city. He said, look, you're saying that philosophers are good for the city. It seems to me that philosophers are not. Prove to me that philosophy is really good for the city. And what happens now is that Socrates shows that, in fact, philosophy, which is the best way of life, is oftentimes derailed by political life. That it is political life that corrupts the best human beings. So in other words, the city is put on trial by philosophy. Here's what he says. Obviously, somebody who has all of the talents and virtues that it would take to be a philosopher would be an extraordinary person. And sometimes these extraordinary people also come from prominent families and are themselves handsome and the like. So these are the kind of people that get everybody's attention. People look at them and say, this is a future leader. He's going to be somebody. And unfortunately, that's a very bad thing, because it means the people with the best natures are going to be constantly fawned over and guided by relatives and comrades who want to steer them in the direction of becoming rulers in the community, so that then they can get all the good stuff that comes from being a friend of the ruler. So everybody's going to try to push these people towards, well, why do you want to be a philosopher? You should do something with your life. You should be a success. You're born to rule. You should be in charge. That's what you should be doing, not this philosophy stuff. And so most people who are potential philosophers get puffed up, vain, proud. They dream of attaining all the honors that come from being first citizen, being in charge of their city. And hence their souls are turned away from the pursuit of truth for its own sake, and towards the pursuit of worldly power and glory. And the whole city wants to do that. And in their pursuit of power and glory, they are rendered subservient to public opinion, right? Because the way to be powerful is to be perceived as a great person by others. And that oftentimes means you have to do things that are popular with your community. You have to give your community what it thinks it wants. But of course, the community is made up of lovers of opinion, of ignorant people, guided by, Socrates says, base desires and passions. That's why he says the many is like a great beast. It is, in fact, the greatest sophist, the greatest corrupter of the youth. Because in human life, and this is a very common occurrence, it tends to be the case that people, especially talented people, will gravitate towards those pursuits that are most highly praised and honored in their society. And in the case of Greece, that meant political power and glory. So because the community praises those things, and because these youths are talented and want to achieve the best possible life, they will gravitate towards what the people praise. But as we understand from what Socrates has said about earlier, that means that they are diverted from the pursuit of truth towards the pursuit of inferior worldly things. And thus they become corrupted by the city, by being turned towards pursuing those things that the people in the city value. Hence, as Socrates says, there are very few philosophic natures that actually manage to realize their potential and become philosophers. And in order to do so, in order to avoid corruption, it almost always has to be the case that somehow they have various talents, but are barred from pursuing political ambitions. And he describes a few of these types. He says, well, there are some good natures who for one reason or another are exiled. So they have to leave their home and they end up somewhere else where they couldn't possibly dream of being in charge. And so instead of being tempted and seduced by glory and power, they can actually give themselves over towards a private life in pursuit of wisdom. Or in some cases it could be because a talented nature is born in a city that is just a small and completely inconsequential city. So there's really no glory to come from serving that city. And so instead of doing that, they can devote themselves to philosophy. And he also says, well, sometimes it's because they're very talented people who are born in the lower class, in the working class, right? Some other art, some tradesmen. And, these people, they come from low status, low origin, so they can't possibly dream of becoming prominent in their city, but they can give themselves over towards philosophic study. And he also says in some cases you'll have people who are extremely talented in various ways, but maybe they're sickly in their body and thus can't become rulers. And the reason for this is because in most Greek cities you really couldn't become a very prominent ruler without some kind of military service. So what he's saying is some people, since they can't really perform military service, can't really become public leaders, so they can't dream of that kind of political power, so again, they can live a private life. And then he also mentions his own case, where he claims to have this daimon, this divinity, this divinity within him that periodically prevents him from doing things. And so among other things, he claims in different dialogues that this daimon, this divinity within him, prevented him from ever going into politics. And he says, but I might be the only case of that. But so there's just a happy few, who are able to pursue wisdom with purity and uncorrupted. And here's how he describes their life at Republic 496. He says, now the men who have become members of this small band have tasted how sweet and blessed a possession it is, and at the same time they have seen sufficiently the madness of the many, and that no one who minds the business of the cities does virtually anything sound, and that there is no ally with whom one can go to the aid of justice and be preserved, but rather just like a human being who has fallen in with wild beasts and is neither willing to join them in doing injustice, nor sufficient as one man to resist all those savage animals, one would perish before he had been of any use to the city or friends, and be of no profit to himself or to others, right, if he tried to go into politics. Taking all this into the calculation, he keeps quiet and minds his own business. As a man in a storm, when dust and rain are blown about by the wind, stands aside under a little wall, seeing others filled full of lawlessness, he is content if somehow he himself can live his life here, pure of injustice and unholy deeds, and take his leave from it graciously and cheerfully with fair hope. It's the private life of philosophers. And of course, although he doesn't say it, this whole description is in basic agreement with how Thrasymachus has described political life, that it's dominated by unjust people serving their own interests and struggling over power in order to achieve those interests. And he says philosophers just try to take shelter from that. They're not strong enough in the city to change things for the better, and they're not willing to engage in all those terrible things themselves. So they live private lives, pursuing wisdom. This is a rather strong condemnation of political life. But unlike in the case of Thrasymachus, Socrates is not doing this in order to praise tyranny, in order to say that these unjust practices are wise, but rather to say that they are an unavoidable aspect of human corruption that philosophers must shield themselves or protect themselves from, although presumably not in the city and speech, which would not be this way. But still, even having established all these things, that in fact philosophers who are decent do know what you need to know in order to rule, and aren't vicious, and do have virtue, and do deserve to be in charge. Assuming that Adeimantus has now been convinced of this by these arguments, there's still a lingering question, which is that we haven't shown that any city, and remember this city has just been described as, in effect, a madhouse or a collection of beasts. Socrates still hasn't shown that there would ever be a city that would be willing to subordinate itself to the rule of a philosopher king, right? And the description of society that we've just gone through would certainly seem to suggest that most political communities, all political communities, would very strongly resist the notion that they should simply subordinate themselves to the absolute rule of a wise and virtuous man who is a philosopher, right? Because they have all sorts of interests and passions that the philosopher would try to stop them from pursuing, right? Now, Socrates does say, well, it'd be possible that maybe somebody who's the son of a king and therefore is already guaranteed political power, maybe if he turns to philosophy, then you could have a philosopher king. It's not impossible. It's not particularly likely, but it's not impossible. But Socrates somewhat comically tries to persuade Adeimantus at this point that, in fact, you could persuade the many. You could persuade the political community to accept the rule of philosopher kings. And remember, this is an important argument, because Socrates has argued that the city in speech can only be brought about if philosophers are put in charge. Right? The assent of a philosopher king would be the first step in the founding of this kind of city. So you need to find some way to get from a city as it is to a city ruled by philosopher kings. But how could you persuade the city? And Socrates has a brief exchange with Adeimantus where he says, well, but if you just show the many who philosophers really are, like I just did with you, then surely they'll see that they ought to accept philosopher kings. Surely they won't be harsh towards such a good kind of person. And Adeimantus more or less says, well, they won't be harsh if they listen to me, or they won't be harsh if they're decent. Socrates, they go back and forth a few times where Socrates in effect says, well, if you tell them this about philosophers, will they be persuaded? And Adeimantus will say, yes, if they listen to me. Right, so in other words, they won't be persuaded. Or maybe if you tell them this other thing, they'll be persuaded. And Adeimantus would say, well, yes, if they're decent. But of course, maybe they're not decent. And in the end, Socrates basically says, just for the sake of decency, for the sake of shame, let's just assume that the many have been persuaded to accept philosopher kings. In other words, Socrates never proves that any political community could be persuaded to adopt philosophers as their rulers, which calls into great question the possibility of this city. Let me just say a few remarks by way of conclusion. We see that philosophers now are most qualified to rule according to Socrates because of their wisdom and their virtue. But their virtue is radically different, even if it issues in the same behavior, from the guardians, because it is oriented towards the pursuit of wisdom and not towards the good of the city. In fact, philosophers seem to be perfectly happy living private lives outside of politics. Politics seems to be bad for them. So how can they be good rulers? Why would they want to be in charge at all? And we'll see more about this in the next lesson. But for now, we can at least note that the many, the general citizenry, could not have this kind of corrupting effect on philosophers in the city and speech, at least, because in the city and speech, the many have no voice. They have no power. They have no authority. But we have a big question nonetheless. Even if we grant that philosophers ought to rule, if this city is possible, how could we ever persuade a city that it would be best to put itself under the rule of philosopher kings? And this, as I have suggested, is something we probably cannot do, because ordinary people have many powerful interests and desires that would make them reject such a city. So everybody would accept philosophers if such a city existed, is the idea. But the city doesn't exist, and there's no way to persuade people to adopt it. So we're very close to concluding that this city is impossible. And that's something that Socrates, I think, shows without a shadow of doubt in the next lesson.